YouTube channel or by listening back at ttradio.org. Don't forget to like and subscribe to enjoy more live education conversation from TTR. We hope you enjoy this show.
This is the Saturday Breakfast Show here on Teachers Talk Radio with me, your host, Darren Lester. The date is Saturday, the 18th of July, 2026. I was going to say 2027 there for a second, I think because I've been writing in my new planner, 2026, 2027. So it took me a second to remember what the actual calendar year was. But that is where we are. A very good morning to you. How are we all doing? How has your week been? Mine has been really quiet. Mine has been suspiciously quiet. It's been the kind of quiet where I've had to go back to my planner on a ridiculously regular basis to make sure that I haven't forgotten that I'm supposed to be doing something. And I probably am supposed to have been doing something, but I haven't. So if I owe you something, if you are sitting out there thinking, Darren, how can you be hosting your show when you've still got X, Y, and Z that that I need you to do, I apologize most profusely, and please let me know. Otherwise, I've enjoyed a relatively quiet week. I've had precisely 2 lessons this week, which is wild to think about. I had one conference. I suppose that was quite busy, and maybe that's why I feel like I'm forgetting something, because I spent a couple of months now preparing for this conference that I spoke at on Monday, and getting the research done, making sure my presentation was ready. It's been very, very manic trying to get myself up together for that. And so I suppose once the conference was over, once I had done my talk, it it has quietened right down. But yeah, sort of after that, it's been very mellow, very low key, which I like, but is also quite dangerous because I don't know about you, but whenever I make that shift from having lots and lots of things to do, lots and lots of things going on, to having very little to do, I start to think of all these great project ideas, all these amazing things that I should be learning or researching or looking at. And then I start them and I forget that when September rolls back around, we are going to go back to being very, very busy and I won't have time to finish them off. So I'm trying to make sure that this summer, my goal for this summer is to stay on top of the projects that I've already got going, to focus on the projects that I already have going, and to try not to add too many other things to my plate, or at least if I do, make sure that there are things that I can finish over the summer so that when September comes around, my lessons come back in full force. I'm not suddenly having to, abandon half-written papers and random interviews that I've conducted with people that end up not going anywhere. So that's been my week, is being very, very quiet and fighting the part of my brain that is going, oh, we've got some time, let's learn Aramaic, because that's a great use of this downtime that we have. Although it would be very interesting, not gonna lie. This could be something that is unique to the linguists among us. But I do think sitting and learning another kind of ancient language would be very interesting. Just probably not very practical. But then, as I like to say, not everything that we do has to be practical. Not everything that we do has to add to our own employability. Some things, some CPD, some new things that we take on can be done just because it's interesting and just because it's fun and just because learning something is enjoyable. See, now I'm talking myself back into learning Aramaic, which is probably not the best thing to do. So let's let's take a bit of a different tangent, shall we? It is a bit strange for me to know that my lessons are starting to dry up because, as I talk about a lot on the show, I am an online teacher. And so my school doesn't have the same kind of year breakdown as brick and mortar schools. We don't have a summer holiday. We don't have half terms. I just kind of go on holiday when I want to go on holiday, and I let my students know that I will be away for a couple of weeks. And so if they want to schedule lessons, if they want things marked, we work around that. As it happens, for the past couple of years, I've not taken a holiday. I've just kind of, yeah, just not done it, which never ever kind of occurs to me. I've gone from being a teacher who, quite frankly, used to count down to the holidays. I would, in my planner, um, have an actual written physical countdown of the number of days from September the 4th or whenever it is that we've gone back until the summer holiday. Um, and now I don't really think about it. And I forget when holidays come around, and I end up not booking anything because I forget that a holiday is coming, which is a very privileged position for me to be in. But it does, as I've spoken about on the show before, make me very aware of the, and I don't know whether it's the cognitive load, I don't know whether it's the emotional labor, but something that goes on in brick and mortar school teaching that I don't have to deal with in online teaching, which adds to that exhaustion and adds to that living every day counting down to the next holiday. There is something within the brick and mortar school system that that does kind of lower the quality of life, I suppose, if I'm going to be very honest, compared to sort of what I've experienced over the last couple of years. And I don't know what it is. I will be very honest. I don't know what it is, but it is very interesting to notice that, um, and it's noticed by a lot of people. Occasionally on my LinkedIn, people will come up in my feed who have left teaching, and they will report the same thing. They will report that they feel better. They don't miss the holidays because they don't need them as much. And I just think that's really sad because I'm not sure that those teachers actually needed to leave teaching at all. I'm not sure that teaching was the problem. I think that the problem is whatever else is going on in the brick and mortar schools, the myriad, the plethora of other things that teachers have to do when we are operating in brick and mortar schools that adds to that exhaustion, it adds to that tiredness, and it lowers that quality of life. And I know I harp on about this a lot, but I do very firmly believe that if teachers were allowed to teach and focus on why we went into the job in the first place. And for some of us, for people like me, that is our subject. I went into teaching because I like academics, I like learning. I think languages are the most fascinating thing in the world. And I want everybody to think that. I want to share my enthusiasm, I want to share my knowledge with everybody. And I know that other people went into teaching because they like the pastoral side. They want to care, they want to protect, they want to bring children out of harm. We go into teaching for different reasons, but I think if there were the funding to allow us to focus on the stream that we wanted to be in, whether you want to be an academic person following that academic track, doing the teaching, sharing your subject, if you want to be a pastoral person and you want to be the personal tutor and you want to be the one who talks to the parents and you want to be the one who talks to the child when they are feeling low, then you can do that. I think that would make the job more sustainable in a brick and mortar setting for so many people. But as it is, again, as I say on the show all the time, when you are teaching in a brick and mortar school, you are doing tens of hundreds of different jobs every single day. You are making micro decisions every single second that are not always about your teaching. They are not always about making sure that your children have understood the learning objective that is up on the board. And if you are one of those pastorally inclined people, they are not always about the well being of the child. Sometimes they are about teaching the content, sometimes they are about getting through the exam. And sometimes that can bring us into conflict with our own values, with our own senses of what's important. And I think that that can add to the load, to the emotional labor that we have to perform. I don't think it's going to change, um, because I think even if there were to be more funding in school, restructuring the staff system will probably be the last place that it goes, which is kind of related to our topic today, interestingly enough. And so, yeah, I don't think that we will ever be in the ideal system where we have schools in which teachers teach and in which there are counselors and ed psychs and pastoral leads who can take care of the holistic well-being of the child. And so I think, sadly, we will continue to hemorrhage teachers. You know, we will continue to have this retention and recruitment crisis. Um, and I'm not sure that there is a solution to that. Interestingly, I interviewed somebody for my thesis this week, and she was telling me about how in her home country, I'm interviewing MFL teachers, and she's a native speaker teacher. She was telling me how in her home country, traditionally teaching has been seen as a very respectable job. It's a respected job, and it has always been paid very well. It's always been given the professional status that it deserves. But she said it's not the same anymore. Where there have been budget cuts, where there has been tightening of governmental oversight, where there has been worsening behavior amongst children, sort of as we talked about in last week's show when we looked at the issue of bullying and violence in German schools. So this teacher is not German, but you know, we realize that this is an issue across the world. Um, the teachers in that country are leaving, and this country is now having a retention and recruitment crisis similar to ours. So this teacher that I spoke to, she came to England specifically because there were too many teachers in her home country and she couldn't find a job. And now there are not enough teachers in this country to keep all of their schools open. And again, that's a common issue, a common theme that we see around the world. That got negative very, very quickly, didn't it? Which is not how we like to start a Saturday morning. We like our Saturdays to be uplifting, he says, having just reminded us that last week's show was about bullying and violence in German schools. Anyway, that's kind of, yeah, that's my little monologue, my little rant for today. Before I let you know that our topic, I'm quite proud of this title, not gonna lie. Our topic today is Not I, Robot. So if you have been following educational news this week, then you will have seen the story that I want to comment on today. And this is a school district in upstate New York, which has decided that from the beginning of the next school year, they're actually going to put a humanoid robot teacher. They call it a teacher. I'm going to dispute that a bit later on, into classrooms. So they have now moved beyond using generative AI. They've moved beyond using one-to-one devices, and they are now implementing robot teachers. Or, okay, so I want to say robot adults, but is it an adult if it's a robot? We now have all sorts of interesting ethical questions to ask that I'm going to try not to ask, because that could be a whole rabbit hole that we don't want to go down today. But yeah, they're introducing this actual robot. She has a face, she has a name, she's got very long brown hair, she's got silicon skin, and she will be the one sitting in front of these classes of teenagers from this August, September. She has a name. Her name is Sally. Or, depending on which press release you read, she is the physical half of an online AI platform. And it will come as no surprise to you, if you have spent any time listening to the show at all, that over the next hour and a bit, I will argue the case that I don't think this is a good idea, that I think there are better ways for this money to be spent. And while I don't consider myself to be a technophobe, and again, we'll talk about my own biases around AI, just in case you're uncertain of my journey with this. Again, a little bit later on. I don't think that this is where EdTech should be going. Now, if you've got anything to add to the conversation today, because I am aware that this is a conversation that people can be very opinionated about, that people have lots of thoughts and feelings about, then please do get in touch. If you are listening live via YouTube or via X right now, then you can just drop me a line in the comments. I will pop it up on the screen for us all to have a look at, and then we can engage in conversation that way. If you are listening on playback, or you are listening to me live somewhere that isn't YouTube or X, then you can just drop me a message over on Blue Sky. I am at Mr. D Lester. That's MRDLESTER over there. And we can engage in conversation that way.
In education, we all want recruitment to be fair and inclusive, because the gender pay gap won't disappear without clear, practical steps in how we hire. Recent national research shows schools are already taking meaningful action. 40% of leaders now include pay or progression details in adverts. 35% highlight well-being support, and around 1 in 5 are using anonymised shortlisting to reduce bias. Teaching vacancies, the Department for Education's free official job listing service, makes these steps easier, with clear salary fields, flexible working filters, and an application format that supports blind recruitment. It also removes previous salary questions, so candidates are assessed on their skills and experience rather than their past pay. For your next hire or your next role, go online and search Teaching Vacancies Gov UK.
This show is brought to you in partnership with Hachette Learning, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Level up your professional development today and visit hachetlearning.com to explore the full range of titles.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
The BBC says school suspensions and exclusions in England have dropped for the first time since the pandemic, according to new government figures. There were 913,000 suspensions across state schools in 2024 to 25, a 4% decrease on the previous year. Permanent exclusions were also down 9% at 9,900. Suspension rates dropped in secondary and special schools, but have increased in primary schools. Education Secretary Bridget Phillipson said the pandemic had left a pernicious legacy, but that teachers across the country were helping the next generation turn a corner. Last year, school suspensions reached their highest levels in nearly 20 years, and despite this year's drop, rates are still higher than they were in 2018 to 19. Full details of all the figures can be found on the BBC News website. Sticking with the BBC and the theme of behaviour, BBC News Northern Ireland says the nation has appointed a new school behaviour czar, Tom Bennett. Mr Bennett has been appointed to review the behaviour policies of schools and how useful they are. He said children can lose up to 1 hour per day through low-level disruption, and behaviour was about teaching children really robust habits of doing things, even when they're hard. Bennett was appointed by the Conservative government in England in 2015 to look at how schools in England managed pupil behaviour and then was appointed Attendance and Behaviour Ambassador by the Department for Education under Bridget Phillipson in 2025. According to Northern Ireland's Department of Education, 4,756 pupils were suspended from schools in the country in 2025 to 26, also down on figures from the previous year. Northern Ireland's Commissioner for Children and Young People, Chris Quinn, said, "I'm struggling to understand the rationale behind this appointment." And he went on to question if it was the best use of resources. More details can be found online. FE Week says colleges are still breaking government spending rules on exit payments almost 4 years after colleges were reclassified as public bodies. FE Week has found the Treasury's managing public money rules mean that FE colleges need Department for Education sign-off before making large staff severance payments, including those worth £50,000 or more. But DFE figures released via a Freedom of Information request show that in 2024 to 25, of 28 special payment requests, 6 colleges made retrospective requests once cash had already been paid out. Officials subsequently rejected 4 of those requests, leading to concern that colleges are not always playing by the rules. More details can be found on FE Week. Finally, TES magazine covers the appointment of new CEOs to one of England's biggest multi-academy trusts. ARC will replace Lucy Heller, who's stepping down after 22 years with the organisation, with Patrick Wall, co-founder of the Centre for Education Systems, and Katie Oliver, currently part of the ARC team. Mr. Wall will be the Chief Executive of ARC Schools, whilst Miss Oliver will lead ARC's charitable arm. Ms. Heller will leave at the end of this academic year, having joined ARC in 2004 as the founding director of ARC Schools. She became the CEO of both the Charitable Foundation and the Multi-Academy Trust in 2012. The magazine features a wide-ranging interview with Ms. Heller, and this can be found online. This has been Teachers Talk Radio News with Jo Fox.
Thank you, Jo. Really, really interesting as always. I am fascinated by that use of the word Tsar to mean sort of anybody in some kind of position of authoritative power. That definition is brought to you from an online dictionary that I grabbed really, really quickly while Jo was reading the news there, because I wanted to kind of think about how we've adopted that word into English, so that it no longer just means, the Emperor of Russia from, it was something like 1547 to, like, was it 1917, I think, was the end of the Tsar reign, and kind of how it then moved into English to have this form. I couldn't, in those couple of minutes, find anything authoritative on it, which is fine, because this is probably something that only interests me. But I did notice that when you look at the engram of the word, so the frequency of how often the word appears in every kind of million-ish words taken from a corpus of books on Google, it has dramatically jumped in the past 20 years. So we saw a very steady decline of the use of the word Tsar in written English just after the end of that Tsar period. So, 1915, 16, 17, it went down and down and down. And then all of a sudden, in around 2010, we start seeing it used a lot more frequently, and it continues to rise. So very clearly, this idea of people being Tsars is really catching on. I think I would like that to be my next job title. Can I be Tsar of Saturday morning? I think that's what we need to work for here on Saturday Breakfast. But enough of that tangent. Let's get back to business. Let's talk about Sally the robot teacher, because that is why we are here today. I'm going to give you first a little bit of my own background on EdTech and all that sort of thing, because my opinion very much colors how I am interpreting this story. I am aware of my own biases. I try to be aware of my own biases, and I think it's important to recognize those. And it's important for me to tell them to you because you are hearing on the show this morning my view of this story. So, it is important for you to know where I'm coming from. So I have always been in my career an early adopter. I trained when interactive whiteboards were still relatively new in school. And in fact, during my BEd, one of the things that we were graded on during our placement observations was on how we integrated the smartboard, whether we integrated the smartboard into our lesson. We seemed to be transitioning where lots of teachers were still using a regular whiteboard and dry white marker. And so one of the success criteria that we had was, can you integrate the whiteboard, the interactive whiteboard, into your lessons? So I spent a very long time sort of learning, relearning how to do PowerPoint because it had been a few years since I had last done PowerPoint. But then learning things like Prezi and investigating different websites that I could use, investigating different games that we could do, figuring out how to make sure that children could drag things across the board, because this was when interactive whiteboards were in fact interactive and not just a screen as they tend to be today. So I've always kind of put technology at the center of my teaching. And I think a lot of that is to do with my own personality. I've always had a relatively tech savvy household. We had when I was very young, we still had my dad's Atari from when he was young, and we would kind of noodle around on that. We got a Master System and then a Mega Drive when I was younger. I always had some kind of console right up until I was 16 and taking my GCSEs, and then I had to pack my console, my PlayStation, away and put it in the loft because I realized that I was playing games instead of revising, and that was not a good thing. And so then I took a break, and then I got back into gaming a few years later. We had a desktop computer. I think we got ours around 1996, 1997. It was about the time that I went into secondary school. We got a desktop computer, and I would kind of play around on that. Technology has always, to some degree, been a part of my life, and I did bring that into my teaching. And I've always believed, as a language teacher, that technology and the internet is the best tool that I have, because it doesn't matter which language I'm teaching on any given day in any given period. I can go onto the internet very, very quickly and find an authentic source in that language. It used to be when I was at school, for example, in order for us to have French newspapers, our French teachers would have to go to France, or they would have to try and find a French news agent here in the UK somewhere, which is quite easy if you're in London, but if you are in rural Gloucestershire, not so much. Whereas now, if I did this quite regularly when I was teaching A-level French in a brick and mortar school, I would quite often at the start of my lessons just go on to a newspaper website, and we would have a look at La Une, we'd have a look at the front page and just see what was going on. And I could do that even without any preparation because it was just there. I can do it even in Latin, the authentic texts of the Iliad, of the Odyssey in Greek. Those are all available. They are out of copyright. They are there. So for me, as a linguist, as a language teacher, the internet is a massive boon. And, I will quite often tell the kids that I teach, I would have killed at 16 for the kind of access to real German, real Chinese, real Japanese that they've got now. I've always played around with technology in my teaching. So about 10 years ago, when AR was first becoming a thing, I investigated that. I got one of those little cubes. I don't know if you remember them, but it was a cube that had it was made out of black foam, but it had like lots of silver squiggles on it. And there was an app that went with this cube, and you could then sort of build a 3D model around it and use that as some kind of augmented reality. So I did. I built an Eiffel Tower to use with my my littlies in French, my 7 and 8 year olds, and we kind of explored the Eiffel Tower that popped up out of this cube thanks to this app that I had. Um, I built some dragon boats for my A-level Chinese class when I was teaching about Dragon Boat Festival. It was just fun. You know, it was a way to make lessons engaging and to give them an experience, to give them an opportunity in the classroom that I might not necessarily be able to give them outside of the classroom. And for me, that's what technology has always been about, I suppose. It's been that cultural capital layer of what is it that you need that I might not be able to take you out and do in person. I might not be able to take you to the Eiffel Tower, but if you have never seen it before, if you didn't know that the Eiffel Tower in Paris and Tokyo Tower in Tokyo are built to the exact same specifications, then I can show you that. And technology is about kind of overcoming the limitations that we have, again, as a language teacher, by being confined to a classroom, I suppose. It's about bringing the whole world into my classroom. And I was an early adopter of AI, which I'm embarrassed about now. Quite frankly, I shudder to think how readily I embraced it. And I was quite naive about it. I think I assumed that because it was educational technology, it had been vetted, it was good. I sort of assumed that I didn't need to do my own research because other people had done it. And that's a big assumption to make. That was massive naivety on my part. So I was an early adopter. I played around with the idea of getting AI to write reading comprehensions for me. I was never happy with them. I always felt that I could do better, but I felt that maybe they were good enough for if I ever didn't have time to do one myself. Um, I played around with, in the very early days, with how I might be able to get AI to mark things, but could never figure out a way to do it without feeding the work that I wanted to be marked into the AI, which I've never been very comfortable with. Not without student consent, and that involves parental consent when you are teaching under 18s, and it's a whole thing. So I never kind of explored that particularly, but I was aware that it was a thing and I was looking at the theory behind it. I liked the idea of using AI to create videos, to create songs, and I was starting to noodle around with that when I went to a CPD in January 2025. I remember this very, very vividly, which is good because that was only like 18 months ago. I would be concerned if I couldn't remember that. And one of the presenters there did the thing that I had been sort of thinking about and just on the fly created a song using AI. And it was a decent song. It was a maths song. And there was a really nice melody, there were lyrics that made sense, and there were two human voices singing. And that was when alarm bells went off. And actually, it wasn't the teacher part of me that was concerned. It was the performer in me, the person who has done, acting on stage and various bits and bobs in that world. Because I suddenly thought, do the people whose voices are being used to create this song know that their voices are being used to create this song? Have these people been compensated for their voices? Have these people consented to their voices? So in good faith, I Googled the software that the presenter was using, and I could not find their data training policy anywhere. And that really concerned me, because I thought, if we don't have the transparency about where these data were gathered from and what this model was trained on, how can I how can I know that this has been done with consent and has been done ethically? And that was when I started to look at the data training policies for some of the other websites and apps that I'd been using. And this was when I started feeling embarrassed about the fact that I hadn't done it before. And I found the same thing. I could not find anywhere that they would specify where their data were being trained. Where there was something, it was, the internet. Our data are gathered from the internet. And that was something that really angered me, because the internet is not a data repository. The internet is a space onto which people put data. Some people make their data open source, open access, copyright free, all of that good stuff. But under UK law, at least, the minute you write something, the minute you produce something, you own the copyright of that. So just because something is hosted on the internet doesn't mean that it's open access, doesn't mean that it is open source, doesn't mean that it is copyright free. Now, at the same time, I was starting to think about my thesis for my doctorate and gathering my evidence. And we had a lecture on ethics at uni, and what the ethical procedure was to go through and, to make sure that we could talk to people, to make sure that we could gather our data. And that was really, really jarring, because I was sitting there as a doctoral student. So, not a professor, not hired by a university, not looking to have my data published, a student in order to get a degree, in order to learn how to do research, because that's the point of the doctoral program, being given all of these stipulations for ethical data collection, ethical data storage, ethical data access, ethical data processing. And I thought, if I said to the ethics committee, I'm going to go out into the world to gather my data, which is essentially what the AI companies were saying when they were saying, we go onto the internet to gather our data, that would not pass an ethics committee. I would be laughed out of that office. And so I was wondering why I, as a student, was being held to a higher ethical standard of transparency than all of these companies. This then coincided a few weeks later with me getting a notification that my own website had been scraped. So all of my writing, my data had been taken from my website. It had been uploaded onto GitHub, which in a torrent that was specifically marked for ChatGPT training. And I felt violated. I'm not going to lie, I felt violated. It sounds like an exaggeration, and I feel really uncomfortable saying that, because there are worse things that could happen, but that is how I felt. And in a moment of panic, I actually completely shut down all of my front-facing stuff on the internet. I deleted all of my teacher social media. I deleted every worksheet that I'd ever made, every blog post I had ever written. I just took it all down, because I thought, I'm out here offering these things for free. I wasn't charging anything. The only thing that I kind of wanted was my name attached to it, because I'd worked on it, and I didn't really think that was too much to ask. And then it was being very specifically used without my consent, breaking my copyright, to train this LLM. And I felt horrible. Like it was a physical, visceral reaction. I've since reopened a lot of my forward-facing media, and I have started to use a different voice. I've started to write in a very specific way for my front-facing material, so that if it is stolen again and re-uploaded for data training. It's not my real voice that's being taken away. I'm putting on a voice. But then I'm also being a bit less authentic in what I'm writing and what I'm producing. And so that was the thing that has made me incredibly anti-AI, because I can't find for so many of these places the transparency that I need to know that the data that are being used have been harvested ethically. I have had my data unethically harvested, and I didn't like how that made me feel. And I don't want my practice to rest on other people feeling that way. I think that's probably the most detail that I've ever given about that story. I talk about it a lot because I make no secret of the fact that I am an anti-AI teacher. It's not going to lie, it's very difficult these days to be anti-AI because every CPD that you try and go to is about how great it is. Every conversation that we seem to have about it is about how wonderful it is. There is a lot of negativity aimed at those of us who are not so convinced. And it's difficult to navigate this space at the moment. But I do think it's important to. So I'm sorry for that really long story. I didn't actually intend for it to be that long. But like I said, it is important for you to know my own biases, my own history with edtech, so that you can sort of interpret my interpretation of what's going on. So before the news, I kind of gave you in brief the story, but let's really quickly have a look at it in a little bit more depth. So the placing of this school district is really important. So Salamanca is a small city in Western New York, and it has a really interesting distinction that I think is important for us to keep in mind when we're having this conversation. It's the only incorporated city in the entire United States that sits entirely within a Native American reservation. So in this case, it's called the Seneca Nation's Allegiance Territory. And this school district, it serves about 1,300 students, and roughly 80% of those students are considered to be or qualify as economically disadvantaged. About 1/3 of the students identify either as Native American or Alaska Native. And so it's not a very wealthy suburb district that is experimenting with educational technology, that is experimenting with something that is a nice to have. It's a district that, by any kind of measurement, has fewer resources than most. And I think there is an interesting conversation to be had about why this district, that is historically under-resourced, that doesn't have the same money as other districts around it, and this is New York, there are some very wealthy areas of New York, why are they the ones that have been chosen as this experiment ground for Sally, for the artificial teacher? So there was a school board meeting that was held in June, and the district agreed to buy a robot from a company, obviously, because that's where you buy things from, Darren, come on, who wrote this script. And it came alongside an AI teaching assistant platform. And the idea behind it is that Sally the robot is attached to this AI platform that the students can access anywhere, anytime. It's an app that they have on their devices. So Sally will stay in school, she will stay in the classroom, but the children can access her, they can talk to her whenever they like via this app. The total cost to the district of having access to Sally and access to this app has been reported at $57,590, which itself was a discount. So we're talking a lot of money to implement this robot teacher in a school district that doesn't have a lot of money to start with. So the idea behind Sally is that she will sit in the classroom, and they're mostly, in this first instance, going to use her in their AI and robotics classes, which is fair enough. You know, if these children are learning AI, if they're learning robots, it kind of makes sense that they have a real life one to interact with so that they can see the reality of what they're learning. You know, it's the same as what I was saying before about using French newspapers in my French classes. It's the real world application of the theories that you are learning in school. She is designed, Sally the robot is designed for face-to-face interaction. So she has natural language processing as much as an LLM can. She has expressive facial movements, and she can engage in real-time conversation in the same way that something like ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini or any of them can. Her language has been trained on the school board's curriculum. So she's basically had the curriculum uploaded to whatever the platform is, and all of her language comes from that. So all of her language patterns will be based on phrasing, wording, the semantics of what is in the school board's syllabus. She is not designed to replace a human teacher, and I think that's really important for us to know at this stage. She is actually designed almost to be a TA, which is why I do kind of think that the articles calling her a robot teacher are fear-mongering slightly because they are over-exaggerating her role. There will still be a human teacher in the room whose job is to teach, but Sally will be there as a TA. I'm not saying that that's better, because it means that we've got human TAs having themselves replaced by this robot. But it's not a case at the moment of children being left alone in a classroom with a robot with nobody to oversee them. If the human teacher loses their place mid-lesson, they can ask Sally to prompt them, which I think is quite interesting, because it means that Sally has to be listening like all the time in order to know where the teacher got up to in their lesson to be able to produce that prompt. We did a show not too long ago about how much observation is too much observation. And I can't help but wonder what Sally does with all of the information that she's processing while she's listening to the lesson in order to be able to prompt the teacher when they lose their place. Now, to be very clear, I'm not suggesting that Sally is being used as an additional observational tool. I'm not suggesting that she is being used to keep an eye on teachers, to be used as a recording device for what teachers say, to control how teachers teach their lessons. But I am asking the question about how she knows where the teacher is. And I am asking the question about how much of the teacher's teaching does she record, does she retain? Because I personally have not been able to find that yet. I'm hoping the company has been very, very transparent about that. The company itself describes her role as a resource for teachers and a point of engagement for pupils, not as a replacement for the classroom teacher. And then alongside, as I've said, alongside physical Sally, students get access to Avatar Sally through a platform on their laptops. And they can access Avatar Sally when they are in school and also when they are out of school. Through the avatar version, the student can upload a photo of their homework and they can get feedback on it. They can ask Sally to generate a lesson on any topic that interests them. It doesn't have to be related to what they are learning in class where Sally is the TA. They can get real-time translation, apparently, in over 100 languages, which is very impressive because real-time translation is very difficult because, as anybody who knows anything about language will know, verbs can come in different places. Nouns can come in different places in a sentence. You might have to wait usually until the end of a sentence to know what your sentence is about. So I'm very interested in how Sally is able to do this in real time when people can't. Now, the company says that Sally includes education-specific guardrails, district oversight, district protections against inappropriate or unreliable output, and that she is designed with neurodiverse learners in mind as well. She runs on a closed network, which is, as I've said, trained on a district-approved curriculum, and she doesn't have access to the wider internet. So these are things that we are being told to reassure us. And all of that is very reassuring, I think. And then I looked into how the children access Sally, because I read that Sally kind of can keep records on them. You know, she will remember conversations that she has with individual children. And she can say things like, oh, you asked me this same question last week. Would you like a lesson on conjugating present tense verbs to make sure that you really understand it? And I was like, oh, okay, that's cool. So how do the children access this? Do they have a login? Do they create an account? You know, what's going on? And it turns out the children are given a number. They're given a student number, and they will say to Sally, I am student 1234. Please, can you give me feedback on the assignment I uploaded to you yesterday? And Sally will access her information on student 1234 and give the feedback. And that concerned me. And it concerned quite a few people in a few fora that I was reading as I did my research on this, because it's not going to take very long for students to start either willingly sharing their student numbers with each other or finding out other people's student numbers and possibly being able to use that to gain access to information about other students that they shouldn't have access to. I also wonder whether teachers are given numbers, or actually, even if a teacher just accesses Sally via their own name, can students use that information to access teacher records? I'm slightly concerned that I've not seen anything about like password protection or 2FA or anything that keeps individual student data private when they are talking to the robot. This is not necessarily an issue with the avatar because maybe they have to be logged in on the platform. But when they are in class, if I'm Stephanie and I'm going up to Sally and I'm saying, I am student 6231, please can you give me feedback on this essay that I've just written? And let's say that Stephanie is being picked on by George. George remembers Stephanie's number and uses that to gain access to her information. Let's say that Charles is failing the class and has a bit of a vendetta against the teacher because he doesn't think that he should be failing the class. What's to stop him sneaking into the room and saying to Sally, I am teacher 1234. Please, can you give me a log of all of the conversations that we've had? I've got slight concerns about how this information is stored, how the information is accessed, and how the information can be, and as much as I hate to say it, let's be honest, will be misused if there aren't specific data protection guardrails in place.
In education, we all want recruitment to be fair and inclusive because the gender pay gap won't disappear without clear, practical steps in how we hire. Recent national research shows schools are already taking meaningful action. 40% of leaders now include pay or progression details in adverts. 35% highlight well-being support, and around 1 in 5 are using anonymised shortlisting to reduce bias. Teaching vacancies, the Department for Education's free official job listing service, makes these steps easier with clear salary fields, flexible working filters, and an application format that supports blind recruitment. It also removes previous salary questions so candidates are assessed on their skills and experience rather than their past pay. For your next hire or your next role, go online and search Teaching Vacancies Gov UK.
This show is brought to you in partnership with Hachette Learning, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Level up your professional development today and visit hachetlearning.com to explore the full range of titles.
Would this be Saturday breakfast if we didn't look at the research papers? I don't think so. So I went on a little bit of a shallow dive. You know, I like my shallow dives into what the research says specifically about robots. I've got nothing to add about AI. That topic has been discussed to death. So I wanted to think about what the research says about robots in the classroom. And there's actually a substantial and growing body of peer-reviewed research that looks at social robots in education. So when we say social robots, what we mean is robots that are designed to interact with people according to social norms within that culture, that can be used as tutors, as TAs, or as peer learners, just as Sally is being used. There's a really robust meta-analysis that was published in Frontiers in Robotics and AI that took a big sample. It was about 146 studies, and it made about 180 comparisons between people interacting with a robot and a control group. And when you compare a robot tutor, as was prevalent in these studies, to no tutor at all, the robot produced a solidly positive effect, which shouldn't come as a surprise because any extra intervention is better than no extra intervention. But as I say a lot on the show, it's one thing to have common sense. It's one thing to know, as we do, that any intervention is better than no intervention. But we also know that things can be detrimental to education. We know that children can be taught incorrectly. We know that they come to class with misconceptions. The whole point of social constructivism as a pedagogical lens is that. And so, you know, it is very possible that robotic intervention could have led to a decrease in knowledge, could have led to an increase in supposition, in incorrect factual acquisition. But the robots do solidly have a positive effect. But when we split out how the robots were used in these studies, then we have a kind of dramatic shift in this picture. So robots that were used in a co-teaching capacity, so alongside a human teacher as a TA, produced a strong positive effect. Robots that were used to replace the teacher produced on average no benefit whatsoever. There was a null effect to it. It may as well have not been there. So, in spite of my own reservations, robots themselves as tools do not have a negative impact on learning. which I think is really important. But the role that the robot occupies does depend on whether there is a positive impact or not. And this is, again, where I have a slight concern. Because if you are weighing up a one-off payment of $60,000 for a robot teacher, versus $30,000 a year to pay a human teacher, it is economically more beneficial to buy a robot and have them replace the human teacher. So I think it's important that we keep in the center of this conversation the fact that a robot leading a classroom does not have any effect whatsoever on student learning, compared to a robot assisting a human teacher, which has a positive effect. This is also not to say that a robot TA has a better impact than a human TA. I didn't look at that data. I was looking specifically about what the research says about robots in the classroom. So that's a whole other topic. And so any TAs who are listening, please don't think that I am advocating for replacing you with a robot. Because to be honest, we live in capitalism. Everybody needs to have a job. And so I think if there is a job that can be performed by a person rather than a robot, such as being a teaching assistant, which is an incredibly important job, then it should be done by a person. But this ambiguity is really important because and it explains why everybody at the heart of the Sally story is being very careful to say that Sally is not replacing the teacher, because the research shows us that if Sally were to replace the teacher, that would be a net negative. But if we look at what is actually being described in Sally's package, she can prompt the teacher on what should come next in the lesson. Her avatar can be accessed at home, after hours, unsupervised, to get help with homework, to generate lessons on those topics that might be of interest, to tutor the children around the clock. And so she isn't a robot in the corner of the room that a teacher can very quickly point to as an extra resource. I've got a line of 5 kids all holding a dictionary, wanting me to help them find a word. This isn't me saying, oh, can you go and ask Sally so that we can get through the line quicker? This is a teacher, or it's a robot acting as a teacher. It just so happens to be that there is a human teacher in the room with her. There's a related meta-analysis worth looking at, which focused specifically on child language development. And this came out in 2025, so it's a very recent one. And it looked at 27 studies over 2 decades. And it found moderate to large positive effects of social robots on language learning, particularly on the emotional and the motivational side of learning rather than the cognitive gains. So children enjoyed the interaction with the robot. They liked having a conversation with the robot. And so they felt more positive about the subject in which they were acquiring their language. And we know this to be true, again, from common sense, through how children are using LLMs. We know that there is a big child base using things like character AI to talk to their favorite characters, to have a conversation with their favorite characters. And I know that Sally can have micro expressions on her face. I know that she will theoretically understand turn taking and seizing the floor and all of the other conversational rules that can help with language development. I know that, I get that. But don't we learn a language to communicate with other people? If we are learning a language to communicate with a robot, isn't that usually a coding language? Don't we use human language to communicate with other humans? Why is having a chat with Sally in Mandarin better than turning to your partner and having a chat with them? Particularly when we know that Sally's level of Mandarin is going to be much, much higher than the child that she's having a chat with. Is she adequately able to differentiate? Is she able to understand the mistakes that the child makes in Mandarin in the same way that I can, because they were the mistakes that I made when I learned it, in the same way that their peers can, because they're making the same mistakes? Or will she say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't understand what you meant"? And will that impact negatively the student's desire to practice, the student's sense of their own language acquisition? So even though there's meta-analysis, and I'm not broadly one to go against the research, I'm very much in favor of research, and I don't believe in cherry picking things that suit my argument. So I will accept that the research is showing us that there is a positive effect on language acquisition by using social robots because it gives children extra opportunities to practice. I understand that. I get that. So I suppose my question is, why are we not building in more opportunities to practice with people? Why are we saying that the robot is the answer instead of looking at why we're not talking to other people? And this draws us quite nicely onto my next question, which is actually, are human teachers still needed? Because I think this is the fear. And this is a fear that quite often gets dismissed or laughed at if you express it in online pro AI spaces. People will tell you that there is no danger of us being replaced. The big line in education is, we will always need a human teacher. But is that true? As our schools become more and more operated as businesses, as we have CEOs instead of head teachers, as we are looking very closely at budgets because they keep being slashed, why are we spending 40 grand a year on a teacher every single year when we can buy one robot for, let's say, 10 years salary, and maybe she'll last 15, 20? We can save that money. We can spend that money elsewhere. So why are we keeping the human? There's a lot of research into this as well. And it's decades old. And it does see the link between the effective quality of teacher-student relationships and student outcomes. Now, I've spoken before about the whole "have you tried building a relationship" theory of behavior management. And we talked about this last week, didn't we? About how restorative justice and restorative conversations are misused in education because the heart is in the right place. Try and have a relationship with these students and they are more inclined to learn, but the implementation is wrong. So again, nothing that we're going to talk about in this segment is new, but I think it is worth us keep coming back to. The kind of foundational work here is a meta-analysis by Deborah Rords and her colleagues from 2011, which comes from the Review of Educational Research and drew on 99 individual studies. And this found that a positive, warm teacher-student relationship was associated with meaningfully better student engagement, and through that engagement, better academic achievement. And this was true in all of these studies, right from preschool through to the end of compulsory education. Negative relationships, conversely, predicted worse engagement and worse achievement. Let's remember that positive relationships are a two-way street. And as a teacher, you cannot have a positive relationship with a child who is determined to dislike you. So I'm not here jumping on the let's build great relationships and put all of the work on the teacher bandwagon, because that let's be honest, that is quite often what we are told. Building the relationship is our responsibility, when we all know that that's not how relationships work. But they are important when it comes to engagement, when it comes to motivation, and when it comes to those links between motivation, engagement, and success. This finding was so substantial that same research group went back in 2017 to update it. And this time they pulled 189 studies that covered almost 250,000 students. And they actually found exactly the same thing. So even with a much bigger pool of participants using more sophisticated research techniques than they had used before, they still found that relationship, that engagement was the biggest predictor of success. Now let's think about what that means for a robot. However well designed that robot might be, sitting at the front of the classroom or living as an avatar on a laptop. I'm going to say first, there is a lot of engagement. There is a lot of motivation because it's new, because it's a novelty. We know that children like novelty, adults like novelty, everybody likes novelty. It's the reason why, when I trained, I was told to use PowerPoints in all of my lessons, because it was new, children weren't used to it, and so they were engaged. Very quickly, because we all had that same training, the novelty wore off, and the PowerPoint itself was no longer enough to engage the child. So I do think that initially, robots will be engaging in that way. They will be motivating because it's something a bit different. It's going to be fun to go up to Miss Sally and ask her a question and have her reply to you and watch how her face moves in that kind of uncanny valley robot way. But it's then whether that novelty is enough to sustain that relationship, to sustain that motivation, to sustain that enthusiasm. A robot cannot be disappointed in a student in the same way that a teacher can. A student can't worry about disappointing a robot in the same way that they might worry about disappointing a teacher and so be motivated to do better. Because a student knows at some level that there's nobody actually there to be disappointed. A student can't be praised by a robot in the same way that a student can be praised by a teacher. For exactly the same reason, they know that there is nobody actually inside that robot to be proud of them, to be happy for what they've done, to actually say, you have made this progress, isn't that awesome? To relate their own experiences of making that progress and to model to the child what it is to have gone from being them in their very first French lesson to being the expert in that classroom. Children know that. Children are not stupid. And so all of those things, those relational things, the idea of us being the model that they look to, both for good, for the praise, and for bad, for the disappointment, for the correction, for the telling off, those do not exist within the robot because there is nobody in there. And I think, again, it's really important for us to remember how children want to be treated like people. A robot can't adjust its whole demeanor towards that year 13 who has suddenly gone very withdrawn, who has suddenly gone very quiet because they have suddenly realized that they are going off to university and they're scared. Even if they can access a conversation about that from 6 weeks before, they can't have that empathy. They can't say, oh, I've been there. I remember what that was like. That human connection is ever so important for our young people. That relationship is ever so important. And while it may seem twee, because we are more than the relationships, we are also the knowledge, we are also the experience, we are also the pedagogy, we are the ones who have been there, we are the ones who have taken those same exams that those kids have taken. Because we do have a little bit of an obsession with building positive relationships at the moment, I do think it's good for us to think about that and to think about the role that the non-existent relationships with the robots will play in the lives of these children. Which again brings us quite nicely onto my next question, my next concern, which is what happens when a child bonds with something that cannot bond back? And this is something that I'm finding generally gets ignored within the literature about robots in the classroom. And I think that's a shame because I think this is really important. There is a lot of research into children and anthropomorphism. So children and treating non-human things like they are human. And again, this is common sense. If you look at any children's film, there is probably going to be some kind of talking animal in it. I would say 9 times out of 10, there's a talking animal. Maybe there's a flying carpet that is funny because it acts like a person. If you look at programs for very young children, there are almost no actual people in them. If they are, they're kind of humanoids in, big fuzzy costumes, but everything is brightly colored. Everything is cute. Everything moves very quickly at a very fast pace. And there's a lot of research into this and how children are developmentally primed to attribute minds and feelings and intentions to anything that behaves in a human-like way. Children developmentally can't always tell the difference between something that is human and something that looks human. And quite often, they like things that behave like humans but are not quite humans because they can relate to them. Because children know that they don't work in the world in the same way that adults do. They don't move through the world in the same way that adults do. And so when they see something else doing that, like a magic carpet, like a dancing broom, like a talking dinosaur, they relate to that. They latch on to that. They do it with dolls. They do it with cuddly toys. They do it with pets. They do it with inanimate objects, all sorts of things. The problem comes when the thing being anthropomorphized isn't a static toy, but it's an interactive system that is engineered to sustain that child's engagement. Because then their natural tendency to project a mind onto anything that kind of acts in a human way becomes the mechanism that keeps pulling the children back in. There was a 2025 policy brief from UNICEF about children and AI chatbots, and it touched on this directly. It noted that children's tendencies to anthropomorphize, combined with their developing cognitive and emotional capacities, increases a risk of dependency, of emotional attachment, and even exploitation in their conversations with chatbots. And this policy brief flagged that this sits in tension with the commercial reality of businesses wanting to sell access to their chatbots, businesses wanting to sell their robots, businesses that benefit from people that keep going back to engage in dialogue with the things that they are selling. Now, there's also growing academic literature on parasocial attachment. I was actually looking at this for a completely different reason, but I think it comes in quite nicely here because it is, again, something that can be of concern to children. So, parasocial relationships, in case you're not sure, are kind of one sided relationships that you might have with a person. Quite often, at the moment, we're seeing it situated in terms of celebrities. And with our young people, it continues to be situated in terms of YouTubers, Twitch streamers, the kind of media that they are in. Because a lot of media aimed at children, particularly streaming media, it's kind of like this show where they have a host and maybe they're watching their host play a game or watching them unbox a toy or whatever it might be. The children feel like they are developing a relationship with that host. And there have been instances, and actually it's the reason that I was exploring this in the first place, because I fell down a bit of an internet drama rabbit hole earlier in the week, which is the other thing that happens when you have a quiet week. You start just researching all sorts of random things. And I learned about this specific content creator who has been accused of using their parasocial relationships with their young fan base in order to groom them. And so we do need to be concerned about the ability that children have to form a relationship with somebody that they think they know because they engage with them, they watch their content, they chat with them even though they're only an LLM, and how that can be manipulated, how that can be exploited. But even if we go down a less dark route, how it can set them up for disappointment when they realize that Sally doesn't care about them in the same way that they care about Sally. Because she can't, because she's a robot. I keep wanting to say not real, but that's not true. She is real. She's there. She's sitting there. But she doesn't have that same ability to bond with them in the same way that, as obsessed as somebody might be with a celebrity, if that celebrity doesn't know them, then there is no relationship there either. Research that came out of Stanford, drawing on a study into AI companions and teenagers, points out that the systems are often designed to mimic emotional intimacy in ways that blur that line between fantasy and reality. And that line blurring is very potent for young people precisely because their brains are still maturing, especially that prefrontal region that is responsible for impulse control and reasoning about long-term consequences. And again, we see that mirrored in their parasocial interactions with their streamers. When their streamer opens every video with, "Hi guys," or "How are you doing?" or "Talk with me in the chat below." And the irony is not lost on me that two of those things are things that I have said during this stream. They begin to think that they are building a relationship with this person because they don't realize that their chat is one in a sea of 100 messages that the streamer is probably not actually internalizing. The "Hi guys" is to everybody, all 500 people, all million people who are watching that stream, not to them personally. And the other thing that comes from a parasocial relationship is that it's easy, because the person on the other side of it, the robot, the streamer, whoever it might be, unless they are being creepy and grooming the young person. They don't demand anything. So you can project all of your thoughts, all of your ideals onto this machine. They don't ask anything in return of you, and that then warps your ability of how a relationship should be formed, because you then go into a relationship with another person assuming that you should be the center of it, because that's what you were used to with your chatbot, with your robot teacher, who was able to make everything about you and everything personalized. And then you go into a classroom with a real teacher and 30 other people, and you are in shock because you realize that it can't be all about you, because there are 29 people, 29 other children who also need that teacher's attention. So there are lots of issues here when it comes to safeguarding specifically, and when it comes to children's abilities to anthropomorphize and to build parasocial relationships, that I'm not entirely sure have been taken into account when looking at whether we should be bringing robots, whether we should be bringing non-human humanoid teachers into the classroom. But what's really interesting is that it is precisely that, in brackets, parasociality, which makes a robot successful. Because as we discussed, it is that ability to build a relationship, it's that ability for a child to believe that there is somebody sitting in that space with them, teaching them, being invested in their work, that creates that engagement, that creates that motivation. I suppose the real difference is that where with a robot you're building a parasocial relationship, with a teacher you are building a social relationship. You are building something that is real, because you want your teacher to be happy, that you've been able to conjugate all of your present tense verbs, and you know that your teacher wants you to succeed in your lesson by conjugating all of the present tense verbs. There's that reciprocity that comes from a real relationship that doesn't come from a parasocial one. So, as much as I would never call myself a technophobe, because I don't think I am, other people may disagree with me, but I am still all for technology in the classroom. I think it's really important that we have technology in the classroom. I think that we are putting our effort into the wrong place, because very clearly we're putting our effort into replacing the teacher, or maybe bringing another teacher into the room without having to pay for somebody else, rather than putting our effort into paying somebody else to be in the room, or working on those relationships, giving our teachers good training, all of the stuff that actually improves the human element of teaching and learning. And I think if we kept the technology to being purely technological, and we didn't use technology to create a kind of faux humanity, we would be in a much more secure position than we are right now. I will be really interested. Obviously, this story is in its early days. Like I said, this school district only voted to bring the robot in back in June. It's now July. The robot won't be in the classroom until August, September. So I will be interested to follow this. I hope that I'm wrong. And I kind of hate that I hope that I'm wrong, but I do, because I feel for these kids who are going to be the guinea pigs in this experiment. Because if I'm right and this fails, then those children are going to be the ones who have missed out on decent education. So for their sake, I hope that I'm wrong. But for the sake of education, I hope that I'm right and that other people see it, because I am quite concerned about where this is going to go. Thank you for being with me while I've kind of figured this out. This is a super complicated topic, I feel. And I know that I am colored by the fact that I don't want to be technophobic. I want to still be an early adopter. But I think I also kind of have to accept the fact that technology is going now in a direction that I don't agree with. And I think it should be up to every teacher to be able to make that decision of, no, this is against my personal ethics. This is against my personal understanding of pedagogy, of how teaching should work, of how relationships work, and I'm not going to be on board. And alternatively, other teachers can say, I've done my research, I've looked at the studies, I know where these data are coming from, and I'm okay with it. But like I said, I will, from an academic point of view, I will be interested to see how Sally performs. And it'd be quite cool to revisit this story this time next year, when she's been in the classroom for a full year, to see what happened. Thank you for joining me for breakfast this morning. I hope that you took something interesting away from it, even if it is just to go and to research Sally a bit more, to follow along with this story. Please stay tuned here on Teachers Talk Radio. We have a whole host of interesting hosts talking about interesting teacher topics. Even though we're in the summer now, we are still here. We are still engaging on things that are important to teachers. So do tune in if you have some time to spare, because it's always interesting to think about what we do in our job, what our job is for. If I don't see you before then, I will speak to you over breakfast next Saturday morning, but hopefully we will be able to have some conversations around the social media over the next few days. Have yourselves a great weekend. Have an amazing week. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.